Hello and good morning. This is Philosophy for Everyday Life. Uh, just getting started here. Um, I'm just going to go ahead and jump in. So, I'm Jimmy. Welcome to Philosophy for Everyday Life. This video marks the first in a series of ongoing discussions that I'd like to hold on Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. I did write a PhD dissertation on the work of Kant, so I have some familiarity. But the secondary literature on Kant is so vast that I still really do not consider myself an expert. So part of why I wanted to do this video series is because I want to understand Kant better for myself. And doing it live on YouTube is my way of inviting others to join me in that process of learning. So consider me a fellow learner on the journey, not a teacher. If you've seen Greg Sadler's YouTube channel, I think it's called That Philosophy Guy, you may know that Greg spent a decade going through Hegel's phenomenology of spirit paragraph by paragraph. Greg, if you ever watch this, you have my respect. I don't know whether I'll get as far as Greg did in my reading of Kant, but I take his work as a precedent for what I have in mind here. Just gonna make sure everything seems to be going okay with the stream. Yeah, I think we're good. So before I get started on Kant, I want to mention that I'm going to be running a series of 6-week philosophy intensives starting in May of this year. So we have a few months still. The first intensive will be called Cultivating an Intellectual Life. And this intensive will involve a combination of reading, writing, virtual meetings, discussion, and collaboration with peers in the program. And we'll be focusing especially on what it means to live a life shaped by philosophy, understood as a practice. And specifically, there are a couple of ways that I think of philosophy as a practice in very broad strokes. First, as a practice of freedom, internal and external freedom. But put differently, as the practice of living an examined life in the company of like-minded friends. These are two different ways that I like to think about philosophy as a practice. And the purpose of this intensive will be to unpack those and explore what that means. So if you want to stay up to date on the Cultivating an Intellectual Life intensive and subsequent intensives, check out the link in the description below. You can indicate your interest and get on the waiting list. Also, if you'd like to stay in touch, you can find me on Substack, also linked below. So if you haven't joined for one of these live streams before, let me say a word about how and why I do them. I think of learning to understand philosophy as something like learning a language. And I think the best way to learn a language is to just immerse yourself in it, to let it wash over you, even if it doesn't make much sense at first. I think this is better than studying a textbook or, to use the language analogy, studying rules of grammar or memorizing vocabulary. Those are all important things, but I think the best way to start is just to, in philosophy, to crack open a difficult work and start reading it. Just like the best way to learn a language and the way children learn, for example, is by just doing it, by practicing. I remember when I first tried to read difficult philosophy that it would take me an hour to read 5 or 10 pages. But over time, it did get easier. So what I aspire to achieve through these live streams is to invite you to follow along as I read, as a way of getting started for yourself on texts that might otherwise seem too intimidating or unapproachable. Kant's first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason, is one of the more difficult works in modern philosophy. I also think it's an incredibly rich and rewarding text. So along the way, I'll stop to discuss how I understand the text, to make observations, to compare Kant to other philosophers, and sometimes to discuss what modern scholars have said about Kant. But I view this series primarily as one of discovery rather than as an attempt to cover all the scholarly basis or to present some kind of complete overview or discussion of Kant's thought, which really wouldn't be possible even if I wanted to do it. So let me say at the outset that I am offering my own idiosyncratic reading of Kant's work, which in the end is all that anyone can do. And I will approach this basically as a series of close readings. So let's talk about Kant. I'm going to switch to this display. Alfred North Whitehead famously claimed that the whole history of philosophy, of Western philosophy, is a series of footnotes to Plato. And we might add that the history of modern philosophy is a series of footnotes to Kant. So let's write this here. And Whitehead said that Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. And I'm saying same thing for modern philosophy. It's a series of footnotes to Kant. I wish my handwriting were better, but there it is. So many of the most important modern philosophers have responded directly to Kant in some fashion, sometimes by writing commentaries on his work, as medieval scholastics wrote commentaries on the sentences of Peter Lombard. We have commentaries dedicated exclusively to Kant's writing, for example, from Martin Heidegger, Theodor Adorno, Hannah Arendt, and Michel Foucault in the more or less continental philosophical tradition. We have reactions and counter-reactions to Kant from Hegel, Nietzsche, and Husserl in that same tradition, as well as from luminaries of the analytic tradition, such as Quine and Peter Strawson. I would venture to say that it is impossible to really understand the modern philosophical tradition, analytic and continental, without understanding Kant. Whether one reveres him or reviles him is a different question. So Kant's philosophy is typically described as a synthesis or integration of two prior streams of philosophical inquiry. And the way I was taught in history of philosophy as an undergraduate is that we have Kant at the center of this X, this intersection, and we have empiricism here, which focused on modern empiricism in authors such as Locke or Hume, focused on experience as the only real basis for knowledge. And rationalism, represented by figures like Descartes, Leibniz, and I would add Moses Mendelssohn. He's not typically included, but my dissertation was on Kant and Mendelssohn, and I would say Mendelssohn should absolutely be included as one of the luminaries of this rationalist tradition. Kant took these two traditions and basically attempted to solve the problems inherent to both of them in his own synthesis. And after Kant, rationalism sort of continued on in what came to be called continental philosophy, and empiricism continued on in what came to be called analytic philosophy, which is basically English speaking. Anglophone. So this diagram, I think, is helpful as a starting point. I think it's more or less incorrect at every point, but it's a useful heuristic. So I'd like to propose my own parallel framework for interpreting Kant. I'm not attempting to replace this framework, but another one that we can perhaps sort of view in parallel. And let me think whether there's a way to draw this. I'm just going to do it like this. I'm going to do another X. Yeah, we'll just see how this goes. The reason I want to offer another framework is that I think there are a number of problems that Kant is attempting to address in his philosophy that the empiricist rationalist framing fails to surface. make sure we're doing good here. Okay. And the first is that some of Kant's most important starting points seem to come from Aristotle's logic. And I'm thinking, and this is not indirectly, but quite directly. And I'm thinking of Kant's use of antinomy and paralogism, of his reflections on space and time, which is not from Aristotle's logic, but from the physics. His use of the term things in themselves, his idea of the unconditioned, which is it leads to his discussion of the transcendental ideal and God in the first critique, and his quest in moral philosophy for something that is good without qualification. All of these strike me as subtle ways of engaging with Aristotle. And I think we miss something if we don't recognize, if we don't explicitly name where Kant is getting his terms. And I don't hear that done very often. So this is one part of the framing. We also know that the works of Aristotle were in Kant's personal library. So we have good reason to think that Kant had read these works, not only because he uses Aristotelian terms, but because he had the books. So I'm going to write Aristotle here. The other frame, the other part of this frame, is Augustinian Christianity. I don't say Augustine specifically. I don't know whether Kant had Augustine in his library, but I say Christianity as it developed out of Augustine's thought through the Reformation. Kant was deeply formed in this type of Christianity as a young person, and honestly, it just permeated the intellectual environment that he was part of. Leibniz, Christian Wolff, other thinkers that Kant was engaged with. This broad stream of Augustinian Christianity was simply unavoidable. Now, Kant's work has often been viewed as a force for secularism and skepticism toward religion. And there has been some recent scholarship that has challenged that interpretation, I think, in a good way. But addressing this question fully, we'll have to wait. We'll just have to see how the texts read. That said, I think it's undeniable that Kant's thought is structured throughout by his engagement with this Augustinian form of Christian theology. And as with his engagement with Aristotle, Kant never simply agrees or disagrees flatly with this second point of reference, but he subtly reframes it with his own way of thinking. So we see this influence reflected in his distinction between the intelligible and the empirical realms, his idea of a kingdom of ends. This goes back to, both of these I think go back to Augustine's two kingdoms, or two cities, or to Luther's two kingdoms. His distinction between legal conformity and internal disposition in his moral philosophy, and his idea of true and false religion in his philosophy of religion. All of these concepts have a kind of Augustinian shape or structure in the way that we find them in Kant. So I find this also helpful. But Kant isn't just synthesizing. Actually, I mean, we could do this. We could say, this synthesis happened in the Middle Ages, before Kant, especially with someone like Thomas Aquinas. And these lines afterward, get wiggly. That synthesis broke apart. And especially a few things caused it to break apart. Not, sort of in the time leading up to Kant. Those would be the rise of critical scholarship on the Bible, which called into question the historicity and authorship of the Bible. The second would be Newtonian physics. And the third would be Hume's skepticism. These three developments caused whatever remained of this medieval synthesis of Aristotle and Augustinian Christianity to fall apart, I think, fundamentally. So we have Descartes trying to build a new philosophical framework, and I think trying to preserve a place for religion, more or less successfully. I think Kant steps in to attempt that same project. So in a way, this diagram is just developing as I go. He's saying, let's bring this back together, or can we? He's asking, can we do that again? Is a resynthesis, a reintegration possible? Yeah. So I've probably shocked and offended anyone familiar with any of these ideas at this point, but that's fine. I think that gets us as far as we need to go for my sort of introduction. What I want to do now is take a look at the preface to the Critique of Pure Reason. We're not going to get very far, I have a feeling. But before I look at the preface, I want to look at a couple of works of commentary on this Critique of Pure Reason, just to set us up. There's so much we might look at. But let's start here with this book, The Bounds of Sense by Peter Strawson. Strawson was an important analytic philosopher. This is an important work, 20th century work in that tradition. Let's just look at this, sort of opening paragraph or two. So this is how Strawson introduces us to the Critique of Pure Reason. It is possible to imagine kinds of world very different from the world as we know it. It is possible to describe types of experience very different from the experience we actually have. But not any purported and grammatically permissible description of a possible kind of experience would be a truly intelligible description. So we can imagine different worlds, we can imagine different ways of structuring experience, but not all of them would make sense. There are limits to what we can conceive of or make intelligible to ourselves as a possible general structure of experience. The investigation of these limits, the investigation of the set of ideas which forms the limiting framework of all our thought about the world and experience of the world, is evidently an important and interesting philosophical undertaking. Evidently, it's important. Some understatement there. No philosopher has made a more strenuous attempt on it than Kant. So Strawson's saying, sure, we can imagine different ways of conceiving the world, but there are limits to ways of conceiving the world that make sense. There's not an infinite variety. There may be multiple possibilities, but there is a bounded set of possible ways of understanding reality in a way that makes sense or is intelligible. Let's read one more paragraph. A central difficulty in understanding Kant's attempt lies in the fact that he himself thought of it in terms of a certain misleading analogy. It is a commonplace of casual and of scientific observation that the character of our experience, the way things appear to us, is partly determined by our human constitution, by the nature of our sense organs and nervous system. So how we experience the world depends on the kind of things that we are. We're human creatures with eyes and ears and skin, and that shapes our experience. The workings of the human perceptual mechanism, the ways in which our experience is causally dependent on those workings, are matters for empirical or scientific, not philosophical investigation. Kant was well aware of this. He knew very well that such an empirical inquiry was of a quite different kind from the investigation he proposed into the fundamental structure of ideas, in terms of which alone we can make intelligible to ourselves the idea of experience of the world. So Kant's not talking about how does sense perception shape our experience of the world. That's a question for science. He's talking about something more fundamental. And this goes to an extremely important distinction in Kant, which I'll just write for us, which is between, he calls it, a priori and a posteriori. Or we could say rational or intelligible versus a posteriori empirical. If if you don't understand this distinction, you will not understand Kant's thought on even the most basic level. This is perhaps the most important distinction for understanding what Kant is up to. So to go back to Strawson, Kant wants to do this thing. He's not doing this empirical investigation, but a philosophical investigation. Yet, right here, in spite of this awareness, he conceived the latter investigation on a kind of strained analogy with the former. So he thinks of science or philosophy as kind of analogous to science. Wherever he found limiting or necessary general features of experience, he declared their source to lie in our own cognitive constitution. And this doctrine he considered indispensable as an explanation of the possibility of knowledge of the necessary structure of experience. Yet there is no doubt that this doctrine is incoherent in itself and masks rather than explains the real character of his inquiry. So that a central problem in understanding the critique is precisely that of disentangling all that hangs on this doctrine from the analytical argument, which is in fact independent of it. Okay, so this is Strawson. This just gives you a taste of what a modern analytic philosopher might have to say about Kant's first critique. And I appreciate the framing of Kant is trying to sketch out the limits of experience. What are the limits on intelligible or experience that makes sense? How do we structure that? Okay, so a very different read. This is Martin Heidegger, Phenomenological Interpretation of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. So Heidegger writes, the intention of this course is to achieve a philosophical understanding of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and that means to learn how to do philosophy. That's perfect, because I also want to learn how to do philosophy. In this brief preliminary consideration, we shall come to an understanding of the essential requirements needed for realizing this intention. There are two requirements. First, we must know what it means to understand a philosophy that has been handed down to us. Secondly, we need a provisional knowledge of the ways and means of achieving such an understanding. Regarding the first point, in the last years of his life, in the course of a conversation, Kant once said, I came with my writings 100 years too early. 100 years from now, they will understand me better and will study and accept my books anew. Nietzsche said something similar. Are we hearing here the vanity of self-importance, or even the annoyance and resignation of not being recognized? Nothing of the sort. Both are foreign to Kant's character. What gets articulated in this quotation is Kant's vivid understanding of the manner in which philosophy is realized and gets worked out. What does he mean? Philosophy belongs to the most original of human endeavors. In this regard, Kant remarks, but these human endeavors turn in a constant circle, arriving again at a point where they have already been. Thereupon, materials now lying in the dust can perhaps be processed into a magnificent structure. It is precisely these original human endeavors that have their constancy in never losing their questionable character. And by questionable, I think Heidegger means capable of being questioned, not questionable in the sense of like dubious or sort of sketchy. Their questionable character, and in thus returning to the same point and finding there their sole source of energy. The constancy of these endeavors does not consist in the continued regularity of advancing in the sense of a so-called progress. So he's saying we always circle back to philosophy. We recreate out of the dust of these previous attempts a new attempt. And it's not, there's not a linear progression upward as if we can sort of just leave the past behind. It's always sort of cycling and recycling through the same things. Progress exists only in the realm of what is ultimately unimportant for human existence. That just feels like we should put a big underline on that one. Philosophy does not evolve in the sense of progress. Rather, philosophy is an attempt at developing and clarifying the same few problems. Philosophy is the independent, free, and thoroughgoing struggle of human existence with the darkness that can break out at any time in that existence. And we certainly live in a dark time, as Heidegger himself did, and he did not escape that darkness, which is, ought to be a warning for us. If you're not familiar, Heidegger was part of the Nazi Party, and I actually don't know details about exactly what his involvement was, but I think he really hits the nail on the head here. And every clarification opens new abysses. Thus, the stagnation and decline of philosophy do not mean not going forward anymore. Rather, they point to having forgotten the center. So philosophy, in a sense, is about remembering. We have a kind of vestige of this idea in Kant, and of course it goes all the way back to Plato, this idea that philosophy is about remembering something we already know, rather than about moving forward to some unachieved progress in the future. Therefore, every philosophical renewal is an awakening in returning to the same point. Okay, so that's good for Heidegger. We will look at one more commentary. This is Kant's Critique of Pure Reason by Theodor Adorno. So, Lecture 1, 1959. Let me begin with the fiction that you do not yet know anything about the critique of pure reason. This fiction is simultaneously legitimate and illegitimate. It is illegitimate since it is obvious that even today a work like Kant's epistemological magnum opus, and I'll assume you know what epistemology means, but if you don't, it's the study of knowledge, study of how we know what we know, or what can be known. This magnum opus radiates such authority that everyone has heard something or other about it. However, in a deeper sense, it is less of a fiction than it seems. We might begin by saying that whenever one aspect of a philosophy becomes public knowledge, it tends generally to obscure its true meaning rather than to elucidate it. I think this is incredibly true of Kant. I thought when I was an undergraduate, naively, foolishly, and arrogantly, presumptuously, I thought I could pretty much write off Kant, and I maintained that impression for a while. It was reinforced by reading philosophers like Alasdair MacIntyre. And it's just this, it's exactly what Adorno is describing. The formulae to which philosophies are commonly reduced tend to reify the actual writings, to sum them up in a rigid fashion, and thus to make a genuine interaction with them all the harder. And this is what I would like to facilitate. What does it mean to have a genuine interaction with the work of Kant, rather than to react to textbook summaries and reifications? To make the point more specifically in relation to Kant, you have undoubtedly all heard that Kant's so-called Copernican revolution consisted in the idea that the elements of cognition that had previously been sought in the objects, in things in themselves, were now to be transferred to the subject. In other words, to reason, the faculty of cognition. In such a crude formulation, this view of Kant is also false because, on the one hand, the subjective turn in philosophy is much older than Kant. In the modern history of philosophy, it goes back to Descartes, and there is a sense in which David Hume, Kant's important English precursor, was more of a subjectivist than Kant. Interesting. The subjective turn, or the turn to the subject, is often attributed to Kant. A turn to the subject in the sense of a turn away from objects out there, not in the sense of rejecting them, but just a shift in focus from objects out there into the world to the subject that perceives the objects. And on the other hand, this widely held belief is mistaken because the true interest of the Critique of Pure Reason is concerned less with the subject, the turn to the subject, than with the objective nature of cognition. This is absolutely true. Kant is not a subjectivist. He turns he turns his attention to the lens of perception or of cognition or knowledge, um, but he does so in order to show that what that lens does is objective. It's the same for everybody. So, the first thought when I learned, like, oh, Kant thinks that experience is structured through our categories of perception. It's like, well, okay, so we all have our own unique experiences. But that's absolutely the opposite of what Kant thinks. We'll do one more paragraph. It's a bit long, but I think it's worth it. If I may make a start with a programmatic statement, a sort of motto encapsulating what you're about to hear, I would say that the Kantian project can actually be characterized not as one that adopts subjectivism in order to do away with the objectivity of cognition, but one that grounds objectivity in the subject as an objective reality. Yeah, I think that's spot on. It stands in contrast to the previously dominant view, which downgraded objectivity by emphasizing the subject and restricted it in a spirit of skepticism. And as we go, you'll note that Kant is very critical of skepticism. He thinks it's self-defeating, it undermines itself, and dangerous. He puts his own. This is another important concept. So let's write this down. He thinks there are two dangers for philosophy. Skepticism is one. And the other is dogmatism. And he puts what he calls critical philosophy in the middle, if we wanted to make this a spectrum. So the two dangers are skepticism and dogmatism, and the way through those dangers is through what he calls critical philosophy. So this, we might say, is Kant's project in the Critique of Pure Reason, and he himself has said so in a not very well-known passage in the preface to the Critique of Pure Reason, which we will come to shortly. I shall read it out to you at once because it may help to dispel a significant misunderstanding from the very outset. His inquiry, he says, has two sides, one of which is concerned with objects, while the other seeks to investigate the pure understanding itself, its possibility, and the cognitive faculties upon which it rests, and so deals with it in its subjective aspect. That's tough. This is Kant language. My hope is that over time, this sort of sentence will mean something to you. If you've never read Kant before, it probably means almost nothing, and that's okay. He goes on to say that important though this exposition is, it is not essential to his chief purpose. For the chief question is always this: what and how much can the understanding and reason know apart from all experience? Not how is the faculty of thought itself possible? Interesting that this is what Adorno singles out. I believe, therefore, that if you accept right from the start that the interest of the Critique of Pure Reason lies in its intention to establish the objective nature of cognition, and I fully agree with him on that, or to salvage it. If I may anticipate my future argument, this will afford you a better access to the work than if you simply surrender to the widespread idea of Kant's so-called subjectivism. This remains true even though these two aspects of Kant's philosophy are in constant friction with one another. How this process of friction, how these two aspects relate to one another in a series of configurations, and how this gives rise to a whole set of problems, to explore this will be the task I have set myself in this lecture course. Okay, well, it would be worthwhile to continue, but we're going to stop there. So I'd like to come now to the Cambridge translation of the Critique of Pure Reason. This is by Paul Geyer and Alan Wood. This is the standard scholarly translation. It's an amazing work of scholarship. I just want to highlight a couple of things. This is a nice little bit of background about this book. Of course, this is one of the seminal and monumental works in the history of Western philosophy. Published in May 1781, when its author was already 57 years old, and substantially revised for its second edition 6 years later. And the importance of those two editions will become clear later. The book was both the culmination of 3 decades of its author's often very private work, and the starting point for nearly 2 decades more of his rapidly evolving but now very public philosophical thought. 3 decades of often very private work. Another just explosively influential thinker who kept his work private is, of course, Charles Darwin. I think we've lost this. We've lost the ability to work in private intensely and intensively. We feel the need to share everything, and to, of course, generate a following by dropping these sort of breadcrumbs as we go. And I think it makes it difficult for us to do the kind of work that someone like Kant did. In the 2.5 centuries since the book was first published, it has been the constant object of scholarly interpretation and a continuous source of inspiration to creative philosophers of many schools. To tell the whole story of the book's influence would be to write the history of philosophy since Kant. That is, I think, absolutely correct. And that is beyond our intention here. After a summary of the critique's overall structure and argument, this introduction describes the revisions that Kant made, and so on. Okay, that's good for this little bit. I just want to note this little comment that Geyer and Wood make about their translation philosophy. And they're referring here to previous English translations of the Critique of Pure Reason. And they say, of surprising help was a full translation of only the second edition done by Francis Heywood, 1848. This is the earliest translation of the Critique we have been able to discover, and often proved helpful because, like us, Heywood clearly made literalness in translation his primary objective. So Geyer and Wood's translation is explicitly focused on being a literal, we might say word-for-word translation. Let's contrast that with another translation by Norman Kemp Smith. And let's just look at some comments here. This is the introduction to the translation by Howard Cagill, someone else, who writes, Norman Kemp Smith's Kant's Critique of Pure Reason has become a classic of philosophical translation. Since its first publication in 1929, it has been frequently reprinted, providing an English version of one of the most important and influential texts in the history of philosophy. Kemp Smith's translation made a major contribution not only to the understanding of Kant, but also to the Enlightenment that preceded and the remarkable developments in German philosophy that succeeded him. Kemp Smith's version of the Critique has become the translation of reference, serving as the touchstone of quality not only for subsequent attempts at translation, but also, apocryphally, for the original German. The success of the translation is due not only to its eloquence, it manages to translate Kant into the language of Hume, but also to the sense that the translation is itself a philosophical event of considerable significance. This little footnote, let's take a look at this. The apocryphal preference of some German language speakers for the translation over the original was reported by A.C. Ewing. I've been told, namely, that a distinguished German philosopher, Rudolf Metz, once said that if only his students could read English adequately, he would ask them to read the Critique of Pure Reason in Kemp Smith's translation rather than the original German itself. Kant was and is famous for being an unclear writer. And so Kemp Smith basically took a very difficult, unclear text and turned it into relatively clear English. So the translation philosophy is different. Whereas the Cambridge translation by Geyer and Wood is literal, Kemp Smith's translation prioritizes being understandable and readable. So I'm going to primarily use the Kemp Smith translation. I think it's easier to understand, and as we compare them briefly here, I'll also note another reason why I prefer it. Let's see if there's anything else here. These are some important tidbits as well. This is still in the introduction. Kemp Smith noted in his introduction to his commentary, he also wrote a commentary on the Critique of Pure Reason, that the difficulty and obscurity of Kant's text stemmed from its composite nature. It's put together out of different pieces, written at various dates throughout the period, 1769 to 1780, and containing the conflicting tendencies of Kant's own thinking. He noted a little later that seldom in the history of literature has a work been more conscientiously thought out or more hastily thrown together than the Critique of Pure Reason. So there's an idea that Kant spent decades thinking out the ideas that went into the Critique of Pure Reason, but he basically threw it together kind of sloppily when the time came to actually write it. And this is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to read. I think there's some differences of opinion on whether how true this is. There was something called the patchwork theory, which thought that he literally stitched together different things he had written at different times. I'm not sure that theory is as popular now as it was at one time, but anyway, just to give you some background on how this was written. I appreciate this as well. Kant's text is above all performative, quote, not the exposition of a single unified system, but the record of Kant's manifold attempts to formulate and solve his many-sided problems. So it's not a finished product in a way. And I think Kant's subsequent revising of the work and also the kind of spirit of his philosophy bears that out. I also think there were subsequent writers, I forget who it was, but someone in Kant's lifetime said, the point is to understand the spirit of the Critique of Pure Reason and not the letter. And Kant's response was, no, you should pay attention to exactly what I said. Don't mess around trying to find the spirit of what I said and get back behind it somehow. So there's a tension there. So this Howard Kegel continues, Kemp Smith's translation is unusually sensitive to the searching and provisional quality of Kant's philosophizing, a quality often lost under the formidable scholarly superstructures that were subsequently raised upon the foundations of the critique. So I think that's helpful. Okay, I think we can now jump forward to the preface. We want to look at this. So this is from Kemp Smith himself. He's benefited from the work of his predecessors in English translation. Don't need to read that. This is helpful. Kant's German, even when judged by German standards, makes difficult reading. The difficulties are not due merely to the abstruseness of the doctrines which Kant is endeavoring to expound, or to his frequent alternation between conflicting points of view. Many of the difficulties are due simply to his manner of writing. He crowds so much into each sentence that he is constrained to make undue use of parentheses, and, what is still more troublesome to the reader, to rely upon particles, pronouns, and genders to indicate the connections between the parts of the sentence. Okay, so just reinforcing for you that it's difficult to read. If you find it difficult, you're in good company. And here you see Kemp Smith telling us that his translation philosophy is different from the one we saw in the Cambridge translation. He says certain sentences, however, occurring not infrequently, present the translator with another type of problem: how far he ought to sacrifice part of what is said, or at least suggested, to gain smoothness in the translation. And we see here, in such cases where it's difficult, I have not attempted to translate the sentences just as they stand. Were the irregularities retained, they would hinder, not aid the reader in the understanding of Kant's argument. So this is the primary reason why I'm going to use Kemp Smith's translation, is that he's trying to make it easy for us. Okay. Preface to the first edition. And I want to compare this first paragraph in the two translations. And just as a side note, you see this A here all throughout the Critique of Pure Reason. You'll see A and B. A refers to the first edition and B refers to the second edition. So human reason has this peculiar fate that in one species of its knowledge, and this is the word I want to zero in on, it is burdened by questions which, as prescribed by the very nature of reason itself, it is not able to ignore, but which, as transcending all its powers, it is also not able to answer. So there's a certain area of human knowledge where there are questions that come up that we cannot avoid. And to anticipate, these are kind of metaphysical type questions. Say like things about the afterlife or about the existence of God or the beginning of the universe. We can't ignore these questions. But Kant thinks that these questions go beyond what human reason is capable of. So we have a dilemma, which is that we can't avoid the questions and we also are incapable of answering them. And here's the preface from Geyer and Wood's translation. Human reason has the peculiar fate in one species of its cognitions that it is burdened with questions which it cannot dismiss, since they are given to it as problems by the nature of reason itself, but which it also cannot answer, since they transcend every capacity of human reason. You can see that the way that this translation is literal, transcend every capacity versus transcending all its powers. It's a more natural reading, but what bothers me in particular is the use of the word cognition. And maybe I'm ignorant of the reasons for choosing this word. But this goes back to what Adorno was saying about the objectivity of experience as Kant wants to establish for us the objectivity of experience. And this word cognition to me sounds like neuroscience-y. It sounds mechanical. And I don't think it resonates with all the things that Kant wants to address. And I think knowledge, to my mind, is just a much better word. Epistemology is not the study of cognition. That's neuroscience. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. My guess is that that Geyer and Wood, in their attempt to be literal, are also relying on etymology to some degree. I'm almost certain that the German word here is Erkenntnis. I'll write that down. Now, can I spell it correctly? Close enough. Kemp Smith translates as knowledge, whereas Geyer and Wood use the word cognition. To my mind, cognition just does not resonate philosophically the way that knowledge does. And this is another reason why I just strongly prefer Kemp Smith's translation. That doesn't mean that what Geyer and Wood did is a bad translation. It's an extremely important work of scholarship. And it's also important to have more literal translations to check against something that's maybe, I don't think paraphrase is the right word, but something that's willing to make adjustments for the sake of intelligibility. So that's where we land. So I'm going to go back to Kemp Smith, and let's see. We're definitely not going to get through the whole preface, but perhaps I'll read one more paragraph, and then we'll be very close to an hour on this live stream. So the perplexity into which reason falls, because of this dilemma it has of being unable to avoid certain questions and being incapable of answering them. This perplexity is not due to any fault of its own. It begins with principles which it has no option save to employ in the course of experience, in which this experience at the same time abundantly justifies it in using. So reason starts out with certain principles that work for things we can experience, and it's no problem. Rising with their aid, so reason takes these principles from experience and rises to something else, since it is determined to this also by its own nature. Reason inherently, by its own nature, wants to rise to higher questions, to ever higher, ever more remote conditions. It soon becomes aware that in this way, the questions never ceasing, its work must always remain incomplete. This resonates with what we were just reading about the Kant's project as one that's fundamentally incomplete, and also what Heidegger was saying about constantly cycling back to this thing that we need to learn and remember and come to know for ourselves. And it therefore finds itself compelled to resort to principles which overstep all possible empirical employment. Here's this word empirical. Extremely important for Kant to come back here. We have the a priori, rational, intelligible on one side. We have the a posteriori, or empirical, on the other side. Two other words that he uses, which we may as well mention, are noumenal and phenomenal. So what he's saying is, we're trying to draw this. Let's pretend there's a dotted line between the empirical and the intelligible. And reason starts out here, and it picks up all these principles, and they work. These are workable, useful, and justified and legitimate principles in the empirical realm, which is to say the realm of experience. And reason has an innate tendency to want to go further, to ask questions about more abstract things, to go into this intelligible realm. And what characterizes this realm is the fact that it cannot be experienced. It's not something that human beings experience. It's something that we try to access through reason. And it tries to take this bundle of principles that work just fine and just great for the empirical realm, and it tries to bring those with it over here. If I knew how to do this, well, no. I could even drag it over there, but I don't know how to use the iPad well enough. Reason tries to bring all those principles over, maybe little arrows here for these principles, to the intelligible realm. And this is where, I mean, in a nutshell, blocking that move is what Kant is trying to do in the Critique of Pure Reason. He's trying to tell us you cannot do it. It does not work. So it finds itself compelled to resort to principles which overstep all possible empirical employment. I need to go back to the text. and which yet seem so unobjectionable that even ordinary consciousness readily accepts them. It seems totally unobjectionable to take these principles from experience and apply them to this other intelligible realm. But by this procedure, human reason precipitates itself into darkness and contradictions. And while it may indeed conjecture that these must be in some way due to concealed errors, it is not in a position to be able to detect them. So we start running into problems, and it's confusing because we had these principles that were totally fine. They work just great for experience. Deductive logic, maybe not that one exactly. Cause and effect, the idea of substance, stuff like this. But as soon as we try to take those over into this intelligible realm, we all of a sudden it's like things stop working. But why? For since the principles of which it is making use transcend the limits of experience, they are no longer subject to any empirical test. We can't test the principles in this realm anymore because it's outside experience fundamentally. The battlefield of these endless controversies is called metaphysics, and that's an excellent word to end on. Now, it's often thought that Kant's project was to tell us no metaphysics. You cannot do metaphysics. No metaphysics for you. I don't think that is actually what he was trying to do. But we'll have to come back to that next time to get more clarity on exactly what Kant thinks metaphysics is and what can be done there. So I think this is a good place to end. At the beginning, I mentioned that I'll be doing these workshops, these intensives, starting May 4th is the first one. Cultivating an Intellectual Life. If that is something that may be of interest to you, you can use the form in the description here, or connect with me on Substack if you just want to keep up to date on what I'm doing. So we will leave it there. If you have watched, I don't think we had any. Oh, we have a couple viewers right now. Hello to you if you're still there. I'm wrapping up, but I'm going to try to do these every week. So perhaps I'll see you again next time.